Hi, welcome back to the class. Today we're going to talk about police and society, really the history and organization of police as we currently know it. Essentially, the United States has more than 18,000 public law enforcement agencies. This by far is the most that most people have. The way that we look at our police agencies, it's by jurisdiction, and they are carefully limited by the law. And just the word jurisdiction means the right or authority of a justice agency to act in regard to a particular subject matter, territory, or person. So based on your jurisdiction, that tells you who's in charge of that particular case. And then law enforcement is also limited by the procedural law, which is derived from the U.S. Supreme Court decisions. So the limited authority of American law enforcement, again, like I said, the United States has remarkably more police agencies that operate far more restrictions than on any have a lot of restrictions on their particular authority. And that is, we just want to make sure that the police, in fact, are doing what we have asked them to do, that they have certain values that they have to uphold, and we want to make sure that those values are commensurate or in line with what we would expect folks that are enhancing the laws. And then you'll see a lot of similarities between English common law and what we've adopted in our United States. The first thing is when we talk about English origins is kin police. So 1900 AD, they looked at it as my brother's keeper. And what that just means is that each citizen is responsible for aiding their neighbor. So the role of the law enforcement was, in fact, in the hands of each individual's neighbor. And they initially looked at this as a pledge system, and they were the idea of the pledge system was grouped by tithings, and they would say 10 families were grouped together. So just think about it as itty-bitty jurisdictions. And so they were responsible for the conduct of all of their members within that tithing. They were not paid, but they were required to keep everybody else in line. And if they weren't in line, then everyone paid a fine. And they were sworn to apprehend, hold, bring to court, and testify against members who, in fact, committed the crime. And we hear this thing called hue and cry, and that means to inform of a crime. So join together to bring the offender to court. And again, this is a community action. And then the other English origins were watch and ward systems. So these were established in what we would know today as urban areas. The watchmen were still the citizens, and they would patrol the streets at night to protect against robberies, fires, and disturbances. And then they would report to the constable, which was a little bit larger. And these were, in fact, affiliated with church parishes. However, as expected, the 18th century English policing, rising rates of crime encouraged a new form of police, and that's when we see moneyed police. So again, instead of it being a sense of community or duty to your tithing or to your neighborhood, if you will, we started paying individuals for this. And so thief takers were individuals that were paid by the crown, the English crown, on a piecemeal work basis for the apprehension of criminals. So this is the first time it's moved from community organization to moneyed officers. Well, as you can imagine, those thief takers, we saw corrupt violence and incarceration of individuals that might not necessarily have needed to be incarcerated, because it was you got money for it, right? So Henry Fielding wanted to clean up the idea of thief taking, and he wanted to legitimize and organize this police force, if you will. So he established relationships with pawnbrokers and provided them with a list of stolen property. He placed ads asking victims to report crimes to his house on Bow Street, and he really laid the foundation for the first modern police. And therefore, that's where we got Bow Street Runners. So this was, again, a organized group of thief takers. They were not necessarily paid, but they did make a living of apprehending criminals. So they were entitled to thief taker rewards. Well, from that, we saw Sir Robert Peel. So again, we're moving more and more into the police as what we know today as being more organized, more structured, and having a salary. Sir Robert Peel realized that the police needed to be accepted by the public, so he wanted to select men, only men who were even-tempered and reserved at this time under Sir Robert Peel. He wanted to choose an unassuming uniform, so that's why it's navy, even to this day. He wanted officers to be restrained and polite. He wanted officers to not be appropriately disciplined. Officers would need to be appropriately disciplined if necessary, and then police officers were not allowed to carry guns. And most of this is still true today. And so you see on Table 5.1, they must be stable, they must be under government control, they must have the absence of crime, the distribution of crime news is essential, they have to make sure that they're doing their job, they have to be a good appearance, they have to be trained, they have to remember that their public security demands that every officer to be given a number, police headquarters to be centrally located. They should be hired on a probationary basis. If they don't do what they're supposed to do for their job, they should then be let go. Police records are necessary to correct distribution of police strength. And so really what we saw in 1829 is a centralized agency responsible for preventing crime and apprehending criminals. And we see that these are called bobbies or peelers after Sir Robert Peel. And today they're still called bobbies. They're still in Navy suits. And this really gave us the early police agencies in the United States. So you just see a breakdown of when the police forces were. When we look at women as officers, 1900s till 1972, equal employment opportunity began to assist women officers in obtaining equal status with male officers in the United States. Police women were responsible for protection and crime, prevention with work with women and juveniles, particularly with girls. And then in 1905 in Oregon, the first female was gained full police power. And then in 1910 in LA, was the first female officer. And so this is a pretty important slide. This is the 3 eras of American policing. There's the political, the reform, and the community. I'm going to go over a couple of these, break these down, but go ahead back after you've learned these and come back to the slide and make sure that you understand, in fact, what were the primary functions, what was the organization, and what were they really trying to do. So the political era, we see politics dominated by police departments. They were to serve political leaders, not necessarily the community. They were considered corrupt, brutal, and in fact inefficient. And so we were, really became, after the political era into the reform era, we wanted to really be progressive and make sure that people trusted the police. So in the reform era, 1890, 1920, upper middle class educated Americans, they wanted to eliminate all political facets. So they wanted to centralize police departments. They wanted to upgrade personnel, and they wanted police function to be narrowed. And so when we look at the reform movement, the ties were just too strong. The police resented the progressives, and police were interconnecting with the functioning of politics, were interconnecting with the functioning of police departments. So we see a second chance at the reform era, 1910 to 1960, and this is encouraged by the International Association of Chiefs of Police, IACP, and what they were recommended were officers were to be experts, police departments were to be, in fact, autonomous or completely separate from politics, which is completely different from what we historically had. They were to be administratively efficient, they were to be in charge of their own record keeping, and you'll see, you can remember back to the uniform crime reports that we talked about in a previous chapter about collecting data. Well, under this reform era, we made sure that the police were really good at being able to collect the data so we could be able to compare from month to month and year to year by counties across the United States. And then they were to create specialized units. We still see this, in fact, today. August Vollmer was a leading advocate for professionalism. He developed college-level police education at UC Berkeley. He advocated for bike and motor patrols, and he really believed in the science for helping law enforcement. So his movement became what we have today as the professionalism of the law enforcement, LEA law enforcement. So on the heels of Vollmer, we have Wilson, who wanted a motorized patrol unit. He wanted to have radio communication. He wanted rapid fire to facilitate crime fighting. And so he wanted to have at least one officer patrols with the best use of manpower. And you see it kind of changes. Sometimes in different urban areas, we might have 2 officer manpower, but it's gone back and forth, I'll be honest with you, as far as best use of resources. So it really depends. Ideally based on the data, what did the data previously say from previous year as far as what resources we need to use and when, whether we have 1 or 2 officer patrols, and then it encouraged rotating beat assignments. So Wilson's era, again, the motorized patrol, and then we see in the community area, well, it kind of moves a little bit from just having officers ride around and around in their beats within their jurisdictions. in a police car. Instead, they really said, maybe we should be interacting. So we see a movement away from crime fighting with a greater emphasis placed on order maintenance and providing services to the community with which they serve. Community model advocates the use of foot. That's different again than being behind a wheel and having that car being as the barrier between you and getting to know your citizens and interacting with the community. So the community area, their goal is not solely to decrease crime, but rather that the hope is of increasing public attitudes. And also when you have a connection, if something happens, you're more likely than to, report the police officer if you have a connection or relationship with them versus before where the officers didn't really know anybody because they were just riding around in their car. And so CompStat is where we compare stats or computer statistic meetings. And so Charlotte, not too long ago, under the previous chief of police, actually went to a CompStat way to measure crime. And essentially it's provide accurate and timely crime data to all levels, choose the most effective strategy for specific problems, implement these strategies by rapid deployment of personnel, and diligently evaluate the results. And so CompStat is really a way to look at data. Some people say it makes for false data because from a CompStat, if we know that on one street in one neighborhood, 11 cars were broken into, same MO, modus operandi, so it looked like the perpetrator did the exact same thing, crashed a window, crash and grab type of thing. Well, we would say that instead of actually calling that 11 separate different car robberies, we would call it one under the CompStat model. We would say it was one perpetrator, and let's go ahead and decrease that. And so, on some level, it makes sense because, in fact, they're right. It probably was one perp, but the reality is there were still 11 victims, and we're really missing some of that. This is kind of how, with use of CompStat, some would argue that this is kind of how politics creeps back into policing even to this day, because urban areas that want to show that there's been a reduction of crime, when they implement CompStat, it looks like, oh, well and behold, there's not 11 car break-ins, there's only one. Well, the reality is there were 11, but the way they're now counting it looks like one. So this gets a tiny bit more back to the political nature of corrections as policing. And you need to know, if you haven't already picked up in criminal justice, that everything relates back to money. So if you have, a lot of car robberies, then you have fear of crime. They want more people on the street. They need more cars. So on some level, that's good if your county commissioners are willing and able to give you more officers, but it's bad if they're not. And then that level of fear of crime keeps going up. Then that causes unrest, and then it can kind of roll out like that. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about 4 federal law enforcement agencies. The first one is the Marshal Service. You can read more about this in the other slides in your book, but they have a 220-year history. They are deputies that have been general practitioners within the law enforcement. They respond quickly to new problems. And then we also have the Secret Service. So in 1865, the Secret Service was created as a branch of the Treasury Department, and today it's really nation's financial infrastructure, payment, preserve the integrity of the economy, and protect national leaders. And then you have what a lot of folks know as as one of the larger federal agencies is the FBI, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation was formed during the first decade of the 20th century under J. Edgar Hoover, who was appointed the first director. Prior to him, later on, he had other political aspirations. And the FBI gained increasing influence over local policing in the 1930s, where the FBI, as you know now, came responsible for the UCR, the Uniform Crime Reporting System, and established its own lab, as well as its own National Police Academy. And then another federal agency that you might have heard of is the DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Administration. This was created by another president, Nixon, in 1973. His goal was to establish a single unified way to look at the global war on the drug menace. And the federal law that inaugurated America's war on drugs was the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914. And there's a fair amount of stuff in your slides about DEA, and also in your book for you to maybe, if you have any interest, to maybe look at it a little bit more thoroughly. And that is going to be the summarization of Chapter 5 for this week. Thank you so much. Take care.